So it's a great pleasure to welcome the last speaker of the afternoon, David Clayton. It's a special occasion since David's retiring from the area of genetic epi. He's made many contributions in his career to biostats and epidemiology for the last 10 years or so, is it? Has been focusing on genetic epidemiology and bit more, 10 or 15 years, I don't know, time passes. More, is it 20? No,
more like
not. Is it?
It
really?
is.
Is it? Oh gosh, yeah, I didn't think about that. And had made many contributions in that area, working with John Todd and in Cambridge and other people. So this is possibly his last talk in the area of genetic epi, though he tells me he's going to focus on other areas of epidemiology in the future. And so thanks very much, David. This paper is about to appear in genetic epi, and I had the pleasure of seeing an advanced copy, so it's a very good unification of a lot of topics of great interest. So
You'll be relieved so late in the afternoon to know that this is a very non-technical talk, so you can sort of relax. Okay, it's sort of this is the general area that I'm covering. I'm looking at it. It's got nothing to do with model selection, but it is to do with the model, and in particular, it's to do with this issue of the link function and how the link function can be thought of as a way of investigating the sort of way in which multiple loci and multiple influences together act to have an effect on the risk of disease. And I am considering here a disease phenotype. So it's a binary phenotype, and most of the time I'm assuming that it's the rare disease assumption. So that's the general idea, and it's sort of perhaps particularly appropriate. That we all know is what the role of a GLM is. It's basically the transformation to the scale on which multiple influences behave additively within the model. And obviously, a model like that is going to be an oversimplification, but I think it can be very useful to guide your intuition about what might be happening in some ways. Now, why it's sort of nice for me is the first time I sort of saw this explored in genetics was really I think probably the first genetics papers I read, which had just come out when I started in a very hesitant way in this area in the early 90s. And there was this very serious, influential set of 3 papers by Neil Risch, which was laying down some of the basis of complex disease genetics. And for the first time was looking at the question of multiple genetic causes of disease. And the first paper in that series was specifically looked at multi-locus models, how multiple loci operate together, and what were the implications of that for the patterns of inheritance in extended families, and for the power of linkage studies, because linkage studies was what we were then considering to detect disease susceptibility loci. And I've thought for some time that it'd be fun to revisit that issue with some more modern concerns in mind. And I was finally forced into doing that when I was invited to Australia and wanted to go and didn't have anything to talk about. So that's the honest answer of where this paper came from. So let's come back to what Neil Risch looked at in those papers. He basically considered 2 models for the joint effects of multiple loci. The first one was basically an additive model for risk, and here we're basically, in all of this, I'm basically assuming that the alleles, the loci are diallelic, and they take on 3 values, 0, 1, 2, and I'm assuming a codominant model where you simply code the x's as 0, 1, 2, so there's a dose-response relationship. That's not essential. It could easily be made more general, but just to make it simpler, that's what I've tended to assume. So that's the additive model, and that very closely approximates another model which is widely used in epidemiology, which is a model where essentially things are multiplicative in the probability of not getting disease. And the motivation for that is a stochastic model for independent sufficient causes. So you sort of imagine that there are a set of completely sufficient causes on their own which work independently of one another, and one locus will affect one cause, another locus will affect another cause, and so on. And in that situation, this is the model which will apply, and under the Rare Disease Association, these models are indistinguishable. They're essentially the same. So the additive model, if you like, corresponds to this model of independent sufficient causes, which in genetics coincides with the real idea of genetic heterogeneity, as so it's called. Now, Risch contrasted that with the model which we more often use in general epidemiology, which is the multiplicative model, which Risch considered the model which was multiplicative in risk, therefore additive in the log of risk, and that, under the rare disease assumption, is nearly the same as the logistic regression model. And that, in a sense, if you want a sort of crude mechanistic way of thinking about it, that's a sort of model for, if you like, a chain of causality, where there are multiple causal events, all of which have to happen before disease happens. And then we imagine that the first SNP might affect the first cause, the second SNP affect the other cause, and so on. So this is a model very much of joint action, where all of these changes have to happen. And as such, actually, that corresponds quite closely with the idea in classical genetics, introduced by Bateson, of epistasis, as it originally meant. That is that one gene can effectively block the effect of the others, because basically, you know, if that event is not happening, it doesn't matter what happens to the rest of them, because they'll not happen. So that, in a way, was Risch's model for epistasis, and those were the two models he considered for multiple loci working together. I've added another one to that, largely because it's surfaced in some of the recent controversies, and this is a model which is widely used in genetics. In the rest of statistics, we just know it as the Probit model, but it's basically, in genetics, it's the underlying liability model, and you assume that there is some quantitative trait, a latent quantitative trait, normally distributed, which is influenced by a linear model, in the same way as Fisher introduced for quantitative traits in 1912, and that basically that gets transformed into a binary outcome on a threshold basis, that if the underlying liability exceeds the threshold, then you get disease. If it's less than the threshold, then you don't get disease. And that's, again, widely used in genetics. It's worth saying that there is now quite a literature in the causal modelling area on precise meanings of these models, and I think in particular there's been quite a lot of advance in reconciling this idea of the underlying sufficient cause framework with sort of deterministic ideas of precisely what you mean by independent causes and so on. And there's a literature on that, but for here, that doesn't really matter very much. The important point, I think, is that the additive model does essentially have an interpretation in terms of independent actions. Okay, so now I'm just going to do some very, very, very simple statistics, and I'm sure it's I hope not too insulting. But the logistic regression model, of course, is the main thing we use in epidemiology most of the time. Most of the tests we commonly use are based around the logistic model, and they're sort of optimal in it. So I'm going to consider the simple case of having a SNP of interest that we want to detect an association in, and other risk factors. which I'll think just represent for now as a stratification by risk. I'll think of a single stratification. You could imagine a stratification by a risk score, but essentially, just for now, consider it as a simple stratification. And this gets us onto one of the big debates in genome-wide association studies at present. I've been very fond of telling people that I've been actually spending the last 10 years of my life just doing t-tests, which in fact is precisely true, because in fact all the machinery of multivariate analysis is we forget about, and we just look at every SNP one at a time. And there's now the whisperings in the literature that this might not be a smart idea, and we perhaps should be looking at things more globally, if you like. So that's really the topic which I'm now beginning to look at in this particular segment of the talk. So here we are, it's a logistic regression model. I'm assuming a codominant model for this. I want an efficient test for the effect of this SNP, and I have some background measures of risk captured in this stratification. I might have a case control study, and in a case control study, you sample cases and controls at different rates. Then this probably is insulting to anybody with an epidemiological basis, but what basically happens then is in the case control study, the probability of being a case in the case control study now involves the sampling fraction, which I've represented by K. But the important point about this is that for the logistic regression model, and perhaps this is one big reason why it's so popular amongst epidemiologists, the effect of the case control sampling is only to change the intercept in the model, not to change any of the coefficients. That having been the case, other models are possible, but they tend to need some knowledge of this sampling fraction. And I am going to consider other models, but usually, for the purposes I'm interested in, we would only need a very approximate sort of guess at the sampling fraction. And we can get a guess like that by knowing our case control ratio and knowing the population prevalence of disease. You can get a pretty good estimate of what this sampling fraction might be. Okay, so we know that if we want to construct an efficient test, a very good and convenient way of going about it is to phone the score test. And if we do this in the logistic regression case, then we take the first derivative of the log likelihood for the logistic regression with respect to the parameter of interest, which is the coefficient of x in our knowledge. We basically get this thing, which is basically a covariance. In this particular case, though, we fitted the stratum effect. So when we come to evaluate this as a test for the association, these mu's are the mean of the y's within strata. So this covariance is actually a covariance within strata. And that test is basically the one we almost always use in genome-wide association studies. It's usually called the Mantel extension test. It's Mantel's extension of the Cochrane-Armitage test. But it's simply a covariance between the phenotype and the genotype within strata. The variance of the test is the permutation variance of the test statistic, again, under random permutations of the y and x values within stratum. So you can do an exact test, if you like, in that way. Now, it's interesting that you can also get to the same test by a log linear model. And that in the early days of epidemiology, at the same time as people were trying log linear models, there were also, logistic regression models, there were also people were looking at the log linear model in contingency tables, and in fact showing that these lead to precisely the same answers in basic. And in particular, if we fit a log linear model in which we have the three first-order associations, that's SNP and phenotype, stratification and phenotype, and SNP and stratification. You put all those first-order terms in. What's happened to that? Well, that's interesting. Just went on its own way. Okay. So if you put in all those first-order terms and you look for the effect, a score test of the effective interest, you get exactly the same. You get the Mantel extension test, which is the covariance of X and Y within strata. Now, quite early on, this rather interesting paper turned out by Robinson and Joule, and the term "some surprising results" was taken from the title of that paper. And what Robinson and Joule pointed out was that while in classical regression of the response on a covariate of interest, in the presence of an extraneous covariance which is related to Y but independent of X, so you've got a strong covariance, a covariate, which is not related to X, but which is strongly related to the outcome. So it's a strong covariate, but it's not a confounder. Okay. Now, in a classical regression, if you put that into the model, then you will gain an awful lot of power because you will reduce the residual variance. However, in the logistic regression framework, when you have this situation where you have Z, you have a confounder, you have Z, which is strongly related to Y, but not related to X, then you actually get a loss of power. And that was the some surprising results of the title in the Robinson and Joule paper. Now, in fact, the paper's slightly confusing because reading the paper, you get an impression that this is about a difference between a normally distributed continuous regression model and a logistic regression model. But I don't think that's the problem at all. What it's about is the difference of the independence assumption. That in this first case, you're talking about X and Z being marginally independent, while in the case considered by Robinson and Joule, Y and Z are conditionally independent. And, of course, case control sampling, basically, if there's marginal independence between X and the stratifying variable in the population, under the rare disease assumption, case control sampling delivers for you conditional independence of X and Z, conditional upon disease status. And it's that which causes the surprising result, if you like. This is a bit of a curio in general epidemiology, and I think that it's a well-known thing. But I think the reason it's a bit of a sort of sideline is that it's sort of theoretical. That is, if something's really strongly related to disease in general epidemiology, it's a pretty rash assumption to assume it's not a confounder. So you would usually not be prepared to make that assumption. However, in genetics, that really is not the case, because essentially we have what is fashionably described as Mendelian randomization. We have essentially a mechanism which is delivering things in such a way that we can very often make with some degree of confidence the assumption that these two things are irrelevant. So if, for example, Z represents a stratification on one set of loci in the genome, and X is a SNP somewhere else entirely in the genome, it's an entirely reasonable assumption that X is independent of Z in the population, so it will be independent of Z in controls. Okay, so in genetics, this is actually far from being a rare situation. It's probably the most common situation that we're in. And it's the result has recently been discovered in the genetic epidemiology literature, and there's been several papers on the topic, the most recent being this one, which I've highlighted. So how do you get over this loss of power? Well, I think it's actually easier to see what's going on from the log linear modeling situation, because of course in the log linear modeling situation you have these three first order associations, all of which represent conditional associations between the variables conditional and the third. So this term here is conditional dependence between x and z conditional upon y. And that, of course, is precisely the one which we're prepared to assume is zero if x and z were just genetic loci on different chromosomes, for example. So if you, the natural thing to do is, why model something you're prepared to assume to be zero? So you just drop it out of the model. And when you drop that term out of the model, then in fact, basically what happens is z drops out of the equation altogether. So you end up with a test which in fact is a simple Cochrane-Armitage test. It's a simple test of the association between x and y, and z doesn't come into it. That's the score test, and that should be optimal. So basically, this is telling us that in these situations where you're prepared to make this assumption that Z is not a confounder, although it might be strongly related to disease, in those circumstances, ignoring Z is efficient. It seems odd. You might have an extremely strong risk factor which you're ignoring from your analysis, but it's efficient. However, and this is an important however, this is a property which is only true for the logit link. Everything here has depended upon the logit link. So what happens if you go away from the logit link, if that is not the way that genes are operating together in the situation? So we go through the generalized linear model, and now we put a general link function in, and in the particular case of the case control study, if we have a link function here in the population, then in the case control study we have a modified link function which in general includes this sampling fraction k, which we probably would have some sort of a rough estimate of. And that will then give us another generalized linear model in the case control study. And if you take the first derivative of log likelihood to get an efficient test, a score test, then it looks the same. It's still a covariance between the phenotype and the SNP of interest, but now it's weighted. And those weights are basically functions of the risk in each stratum. And but this is still a test where this is now a covariance within each stratum, and then you're combining that across strata in the normal way. But that test, which would be the classic one, is still sort of allowing for the stratification to be a confounder. If again you're prepared to forget about that, if you're prepared to say x is independent of z, I'm prepared to drop that out of the equation, then the test simplifies, and it goes back to being a simple covariance between x and y taken across the whole data, but now it's weighted. Now each per xy is now weighted by a function which depends upon the risk in that segment of the population. So, for example, you're going to get a situation where either high-risk individuals get more weight or low-risk individuals get more weight. And basically, the weight function here depends upon the link function. So the optimal test will depend on how we think different genetic loci operate together in those ways. So here's sort of what it works out at for the weight function looks at for various links. The first one is the multiplicative model, log or logit. And again, we can think of pi as being very small, so forget about this. So in this case, you see that the weight function is 1. So that's the straightforward situation of where we think the logistic model is the right one, And in that situation, ignoring Z, however strongly it's related to outcome, is the right thing to do. So it's unweighted. In this additive model, which is the model of no epistasis, in the model of no epistasis, we would weight inversely according to risk. So low-risk people would get high weight in the analysis, high-risk people would get low risk in the analysis. The probit function also has a weight, which is not fully it's not clear what shape that is, but I'll show you in a plot, and we'll come to this other function later. That's what the weight function looks like for the probit model, which is so much beloved by geneticists. And you see that it's another one which weights low-risk people high and high-risk people low. So again, you're still doing a simple covariance test, but you're weighting different segments of the population differently. This generalized transformation, taking a Cox transformation of the odds, was introduced by Breslow and Storer back in the early 1980s, when general epidemiologists were wrestling with this problem and trying to decide between additive and multiplicative models in some way. And the nice thing about it is that this essentially embeds both models in the same family, with lambda equals naught takes you to a logistic regression model, lambda equals 1 takes you to an additive model, and then you get all the lambdas in between and potentially lambdas outside that range as well. The probit model corresponds with a lambda of about 0.12, so that's sort of towards the additive model, away from the multiplicative model, but perhaps only a little way. So, what's the effect of misspecifying the link? What's the effect of power on the power of the test? Well, I just looked at two possibilities, one in which there was 100-fold differences in risk between the strata, and one in which there was a 10-fold difference in risk between the strata. So again, you're looking at extraneous variables which are important and potentially hugely important. And this is the effect. It's probably best to concentrate on this one. This is the power for using the classic Mantel extension test, which is what we do all the time, and which comes down to ignoring the stratification, when in fact the true model is not a logistic model, but is taken on by something else in the Box-Cox family. So this value, 1.0, corresponds to the additive model of risks. That's the no epistasis model. And you can say when there's no epistasis, in fact, you do lose some power. If you actually have this side, you can get gross loss of power. And that is sort of supramultiplicative. That's extremely strong epistatic action. So that would lead to a gross loss of power. But you get a loss of power that side as well. So what happens well, you can estimate this parameter of the link function by maximum likelihood from the data. And I went through that with some type 1 diabetes data some years back. And this was the likelihood function, the log likelihood ratios that I got for the test for lambda. The best, actually, you sort of end up just about excluding the multiplicative model. This value, for those of you who can't say, the maximum likelihood estimate is 0.05. So it's pretty close to a multiplicative model. And the additive model is somewhere out here. So, you can reject the idea of no epistatic action very considerably. There's a bit of moderate movement over that way. Even the probit model corresponds to about here, and that's pretty seriously rejected as well. Okay, so those are results. Now I'm making a few just remarks, really. Okay. These remarks I've made so often that I'm becoming extremely boring on it, but in general, for anybody who's been through the epidemiologists wrestling with the idea of interaction and its meaning in the early 80s, seeing the position in the genetic epidemiology literature now is a bit disappointing. There's very, very widespread refusal to define terms. Different people use terms in different ways. A classic example is epistasis, where you will find a lot of papers in the genetic epidemiology literature now will describe epistasis. They say they found epistasis when they find an interaction in the logistic regression model. And that's a deviation from the multiplicative model. While in fact, Risch, probably I think sensibly, used no interaction in the logistic regression model as a model for epistasis. So we have half the community describing as epistasis something which is the direct opposite of it in some ways. Gene-environment interaction is in every grant application, but is rarely defined. And this sort of loose thinking, unfortunately, I think has effects, and that sort of ripples through into other things. So one is the idea of this issue of the implications for testing, and in particular the question about the one at a time strategy. Now, the one-at-a-time strategy has been widely criticized on the grounds that how can you test things one at a time when, if you think about the mechanism, epistasis, the involvement of multiple genes, must be widespread. In fact, it must be the general rule rather than the exception. So the argument goes, if epistasis is widespread, then we shouldn't be ignoring all these other genes when we're looking at each gene. However, in Risch's model of epistasis is the logistic regression model. It's the multiplicative one. And that's precisely the model in which it's efficient to forget about the other variables. Okay. So, in fact, this is a nice counterintuitive result, that in fact, if we have got epistasis, then what we're doing in ignoring these other variables is probably the sensible thing to be doing. Where we want to start doing something different is if we didn't have epistasis. Then we should be weighting the argument differently. And that's totally counterintuitive to what people think. So, finally, on this general issue of link functions is a final discussion which has taken place in the literature on the implications for prediction. And here there's, I think, an interesting question, which essentially says, given that we know the heritability, and perhaps we'll know the heritability rather better now, but given that we know the heritability, then what is the potential for predicting the outcome, predicting disease, if we measured all the relevant genes? And this, of course, has relevance to the whole sort of debate about personalized medicine and so on. And that's really why people have started looking at this question. And here, the simple idea is if you fix the heritability, well, here I'm measuring heritability in a rather different way from the previous speaker. This is being measured in terms of so-called lambda S, which is the recurrence risk in a sibling of an affected person divided by the population risk. So this is a good measure of the heritability of risk. Now, given that you have that, you fix lambda S, and for example, for type 1 diabetes, that's probably about 10 or a bit less, or something like that. For type 2 diabetes, it's I don't know, 3 or something, much smaller. But if you know that, and you know the distribution of the risk score, the additive risk score, and since probably a lot of genes are involved, that's probably pretty close to normal. Then you can work out what the receiver operating characteristic curve would look like if you were able to measure every relevant gene. And this is one which I published some time back, but another group have done exactly the same. And these are receiver operating characteristic curves for lambda s of 1.5, 2, 3, 5, and 10. Now, these, to any epidemiologists, are pretty depressing because these are rare diseases, and basically what these are telling you, even when the heritability, the lambda s, is really high, is that you can't get high sensitivity without having a very high false positive rate. And this, therefore, is fairly depressing. And this is in the optimistic situation that you have been able to identify every gene relevant and measure it. Well, that's been contested by Vischer's group, and they use a probit model, and they're getting substantially better receiver operating characteristic curves. This is, for example, for a lambda s of 5, the solid lines are the probit, the predictions of the probit model, while the dotted line is a prediction of the multiplicative, the logistic model. And these probits are all for different prevalence of the condition. So as we go to higher and higher prevalences, and we get away from rare diseases with the probit model, we go up further and further, and we get better and better prediction. So that indicates that the difference in these prediction things is actually something to do with the link function. So I started off trying to work out what sort of prediction you would get under Risch's other model, under the model of independent sufficient causes. And there are assumptions you can do to make that happen, and I did it. And for a long time, I thought my program wouldn't work, because every time I did it, I couldn't see the receiver operating curve. The reason was that it was actually sticking to the axes. It was perfect. And so after a while, I stopped worrying about my code and started to think. And the reason is that under that model, under the model of independent sufficient causes, basically everything reverts to Mendelian assumptions. Because basically, for the low population prevalence, the risk, remember, every risk variant is a sufficient cause. To have a moderate or high lambda s, you have to have a high penetrance for each sufficient cause. If the